What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Grand Theories, Episode 5. I am your host, Mark. This is a podcast where we explore lesser-known ideas that try to explain really big things about the world we live in. Today's episode is pretty packed, so I'm not going to spend too much time on the housekeeping notes before we get started, but just a couple of quick things. If you're a fan of the show, firstly, I'd like to thank you for listening. You are the folks that keep this thing on schedule once a month. You can get in touch with me outside of the show. I'm on social media. My Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook accounts are linked in the show notes, and you can also reach me by email, grandtheories@gmail.com. And secondly, I'd like to thank Dr. Franz Berto, who provided some insights and guidance on the readings for today's show. I appreciate his help on making this episode into what it is. Today, our primary topic is an idea called impossible worlds. But before we jump into those, we need to start with something a little bit simpler. Possible worlds. I like to think of possible worlds as being like laboratories for philosophers and metaphysicians, places where they can conduct analytical and logical work without any real restrictions or bounds. Possible worlds, in the simplest sense, are ways that our world could have been. To illustrate this, let's think about the book The Man in the High Castle, which was written by sci-fi author Philip K. Dick, and has also been recently adapted into a television series. The story of The Man in the High Castle takes place in the 60s, and it shows a world where the Axis powers won World War II, as opposed to our current timeline. In this fictional reality, things are radically different. To illustrate a few examples, Adolf Hitler survived the war in this world. The U.S. was carved up by Germany and Japan into smaller territories. Perhaps most unimaginably, Nazi Germany even chose to drain the Mediterranean Sea so that they could essentially create more land. As you can tell, the world in The Man in the High Castle is not our world. It's far different. But we do have to consider the fact that this world is certainly possible had things gone much, much differently. What we just discussed is one possible world, which is part of an infinite number of other possible worlds that could have occurred under different events. And in terms of what possible worlds are like, they can be so close to our reality that it's almost indistinguishable. For example, we could have one where instead of wearing a red t-shirt today, I wore a blue t-shirt. And that's it. That's the only thing that's different. Everything else on the entire timeline is the same. We can imagine possible worlds that are nothing like our current reality. Perhaps worlds where people can fly, or where superheroes really exist in day-to-day reality. Any world you've seen represented in a work of fiction, be it Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, or even Star Wars, are all possible worlds. But let's not stop there, because the truth is, most of our works of fiction really don't even scratch the surface of where possible worlds can go. And there's good reason for this, because for fiction to be interesting, it has to be somewhat close to our current reality. It has to be grounded in what we understand. If you get too far away from that, things get a little too bizarre for our frames of reference. There could be possible worlds without you, me, or without humanity at all. Earth might not exist, or even planets or stars in other possible worlds. Worlds where the structure of the entire universe is nothing like ours, nothing we'd ever recognize, where the laws of physics don't hold up, and where celestial objects consist of things our minds can barely imagine. For example, we could have one possible world that is nothing but a gravityless red mist, where sound moves faster than light. Perhaps this possible world contains nothing but, let's say, one square-shaped planet made of nothing but sand. Now, this dry-sounding state of existence might be a far-fledged possibility relative to our timeline. The world where I'm wearing a blue t-shirt certainly sounds feasible, but this red mist world really doesn't. But when you look at it from a philosophical perspective, the red mist world is just as legitimate as the blue t-shirt world. And both of those worlds are just two of an infinite number of deviations on the scale of the possible. And perhaps most unsettling is that the overwhelming majority of these possible worlds are going to be beyond the capabilities of our limited, ultimately earthly, imaginations. Now, this might sound like a fun exercise on paper, but what is it that we're talking about here exactly? What are possible worlds other than some fictional description of an alternate reality? What does a red mist world really have to do with anything? Well, on the technical side of things, possible worlds are really helpful to philosophers in their work. For example, we can measure the truthhood of certain facts or statements using other possible worlds. 2 plus 2 is going to be 4 in any possible world, be it this world, blue t-shirt world, even the red mist world. There's really no conceivable scenario where 2 plus 2 would be anything other than 4. In that regard, we can consider 2 plus 2 equals 4 to be a stone-cold fact. As philosophers would say, it is necessarily true. Compare this to the fact that George W. Bush was the 43rd President of the United States. Now, outside of our own, we can certainly imagine a lot of other possible worlds where this would still be true. This would certainly be the case in my blue t-shirt world. But independent of the Florida recount controversy, there are plenty of scenarios where he wouldn't have been president. There are worlds where he never qualified for the election, or worlds where he just decided to do something else with his life, or worlds where the wave of history was entirely different. Bush being president in the Man in the High Castle world, for example, is really hardly feasible. There could be worlds where George W. Bush wasn't even born, or worlds where life and humanity don't even exist, such as in the red mist world. So the fact itself that Bush was the 43rd President of the United States is far from necessarily true. It doesn't hold in all possible worlds. This is just one type of exercise among many where possible worlds come into use. The truth is that today they are practically indispensable to philosophers. But philosophers aren't the only ones who use possible worlds. In fact, we all use them every day in our day-to-day lives. Whenever someone says something like, "If I had just gotten an A in that one class, I would have gotten into so-and-so school," they're referring directly to another possible world. We make those types of statements all the time to help us ground our current reality. But generally, whenever we refer to other possible worlds, we're essentially talking hypothetically about situations that could have been had things gone just a little bit or a whole lot differently. But we're not talking about actual other worlds or universes, are we? David Lewis was an American philosopher who put forward the idea that possible worlds are actual, real worlds. These worlds are made of the same physical stuff that ours are. So they're not hypothetical figments of our speech or imaginations, but actual worlds that exist out there somewhere, some of which contain living beings that experience the world around them, just like you and I do. Many of those real worlds even contain other versions of you. Now, before we dive into this, we need to clarify what we mean when we say something exists or that it is real. In the film The Matrix, Lawrence Fishburne's sage-like character, Morpheus, is trying to explain to Keanu Reeves' character, Neo, that his day-to-day world isn't the actual world. He explains to Neo that he lives in a simulated dream world, and that the actual world around him is nothing what he thinks. Neo reacts in denial, saying that this can't be real, and it's at that moment when Morpheus asks Neo a very important question. Quote, "What is real? How do you define real?" End quote. The question that Morpheus posed is exactly what philosophers who work in the field of ontology try to answer. Ontologists study what it means to exist, or to be real. I would argue that in our day-to-day life there is a default stance towards this question. Things that are real are things that we can all touch or see or use any of our senses to detect. We can confirm that they're real because others around us can detect them too. In this view, chairs and tables and cats are real because they're detected by almost all of us on a daily basis. Mythical creatures like unicorns or Bigfoot aren't real, however, because even though we might know what they look like, no one's ever really proven that they've seen one. And in this view, possible worlds probably aren't real because, well, they didn't ever happen. They're just figments of our imaginations at best. Some ontologists are on board with this reality, but the overwhelming majority see things a little bit differently. On one end of the spectrum, there are those who think that the only thing that's real are atoms or quarks or strings or whatever the smallest unit of stuff is according to science at the time. These ontologists would argue that chairs don't exist. Chairs, in their view, are just a bunch of atoms arranged in a chair-like setup. The only reason we see a chair is because our mind interprets it to be a chair based on experiences we've had about chairs. And this view can be applied to just about any other object. Now, this might sound like a little bit of a boring way to view the world, but this type of parsimonious ontology can lead us to some very interesting views about the power of our minds to shape our realities. But that's perhaps something we should talk about in a future episode. The ontologists on the other end of the spectrum think that just about everything is real. And we're not just talking about chairs, tables, and cats, but things like unicorns and Bigfoot too. One line of argument goes that even though there aren't really unicorns in the real world, at least that we know about, we still know a lot of things about them. There are facts about unicorns, such as their having a horn or being able to fly. There's a pretty clear image of a unicorn out there that most of us can access in our minds simply based on society's dialogue about unicorns. In that sense, can we really say that unicorns don't have any basis in reality at all? Some ontologists go even further than this, admitting abstract objects like numbers and dreams, fictional characters, or even properties like redness or sharpness. On this end of the spectrum, there's certainly much more to reality than what meets any one being's eye. So now, when David Lewis claims that possible worlds are real, which side is he falling on exactly? Well, as it turns out, a little bit of both. To us in this specific timeline, the timeline where you're listening to this podcast right now, possible worlds are abstract objects, a lot like a number would be. A possible world isn't something we can touch or really physically access in our world. All we can really do is talk about them, think about them, or use them to help us solve problems. Now that probably seems pretty fair, but Lewis does take the position that outside our world, possible worlds do actually, physically, exist, meaning that there are an infinite number of other worlds out there, millions, billions, or even more of which have versions of me, you, and all of us living out slightly or completely different lives. And according to Lewis, these worlds are just as real to those people as this one is to you and me. To our counterparts in other worlds, you and I are just abstract objects, just as they are to us. Lewis claims that even though these worlds really do physically exist, there's no way we'd ever be able to access them. The events that take place in other worlds don't take place before or after those here. There's no sort of relationship around time at all. They aren't any sort of distance away from us either. They're just in some other plane of existence altogether. A plane of existence that we will always be completely cut off from, never able to access. So why does David Lewis think that possible worlds are real? Well, he made a lot of arguments throughout his career to support his case. And the big theme of all those arguments is that if possible worlds aren't real, their usefulness in philosophy and in life would diminish quite considerably. To see what he means, let's dive into one line of reasoning. In 2010, the United States men's college basketball national championship was played between the Duke Blue Devils and the Butler Bulldogs. For those that don't watch basketball, Duke is a perennial powerhouse in the sport, while Butler was a smaller program who was entering the limelight for the first time. Duke was heavily favored, but the game remained close until the very end. In the last couple seconds, Duke was up by 2 points, but Butler had the ball and one more chance to pull off the upset. Butler's best player, Gordon Hayward, heaved an improbable half-court shot that, were it to go in, would add 3 points to Butler's score and win them the championship. On live TV, Hayward's shot seemed to float forever, until it bounced off the backboard and popped in and out of the rim, just barely missing. Duke won by the skin of their teeth. Now I'm going to go ahead and put forward the argument that if Hayward had just put a little less force on his shot and the ball went into the basket, that Butler would have won the championship. I wholly believe that very few would go against me on that. That's just how basketball works. Well, in line with Lewis's reasoning, one thing that makes the argument so strong is that, according to him, there are a multitude of other possible worlds out there where Hayward's shot did go in. Possible worlds where Butler walked off the floor champions and Duke the runners-up. It's because we can appeal to those other possible worlds that we can really know this. And as it goes, if these possible worlds weren't real, weren't actually out there existing somewhere, how would we really actually know that Duke would lose if the shot went in? How can we really be sure that all of our logical reasoning about possibilities and ways things could have been would really be true? If we don't have other possible worlds out there to actually refer to, where exactly would the physical evidence be? Now, there are several ways to argue against what Lewis has been saying, and plenty of philosophers have taken up arms on both sides. And the whole thing raises some pretty interesting topics for discussion. For one, we can imagine, or try to imagine, a possible world with absolutely nothing in it. No space, no time, no beings, no consciousness, nothing. But what about a possible world where there was no space, no time, no nothing, except for numbers? Could that really be real? Is that possible? We could go on just about all day here, but the important point is that David Lewis and other possible world specialists aren't the only corner of academia to entertain the idea of possible worlds being out there. In fact, we see similar ideas within the halls of physics and astronomy. Previously on this podcast, we discussed the idea of the multiverse. To review very briefly, when we generally think about the universe, we tend to think of it as everything that there is. Well, in a multiverse, our universe is just one little tiny corner of existence. Our universe, which we'll define as everything created by the Big Bang, would be just one of many universes like it or not like it. The multiverse was a purely theoretical concept for some time, but there are more and more reports emerging that claim to have physical evidence that our universe may be just the beginning of what's out there. As far as what is contained in other universes, well, that is still entirely speculation, but plenty of speculating has been done. Brian Greene is a popular string theorist who, in his 2011 book, laid out 9 possible setups for the multiverse. One of these setups is called a quilted multiverse, and in this case, space extends on forever and ever. It never ends. In this infinite space, Greene mathematically reasons that there would also be infinite universes, where the laws of physics would largely be the same. Now, because of practical physical limitations, we really wouldn't be able to access these other universes. They'd just be too far away. But along the lines of David Lewis's thinking, in a quilted multiverse, there would be universes for every possible scenario, event, or possibility that we could imagine. Another one of Greene's setups is called the Quantum Multiverse, which lines up with what is called the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. According to this interpretation, and please pardon my very basic description here, whenever some action occurs in the world, and it has more than one possible outcome, this world splits into 2 worlds. So let's say you have to decide between 2 dishes that you really want at a restaurant. Once you make that decision, you irreversibly move into a world where you chose fettuccine alfredo. In the meantime, another version of you splits off into a world where you chose shrimp Florentine. As you can imagine, these types of splits occur all the time across the universe, resulting in a complex multiverse of parallel universes. Now, this may sound slightly ridiculous, but the truth is that the many worlds interpretation is one way of making the math that structures quantum mechanics work. It's advocated for by people like popular physicist Sean Carroll, and even Brian Greene himself. Again, these ideas about the multiverse are highly speculative, but we can see some parallels between them and Lewis's view on the philosophical existence of possible worlds. We should note that these concepts don't align perfectly. At the end of the day, scientists like Brian Greene are still dealing with physical and practical limitations in describing these alternate worlds. There's certainly limits to just how wild they can be. This isn't the case with philosophical possible worlds. Possible worlds simply describe potential compositions or setups for the world. These setups don't necessarily need to obey or abide by physical laws or implications. They're just ways things could be arranged. What do I mean here, exactly? Well, imagine a possible world out there where humanity and all of our thousands of years of history, from the start up until now, played out on the planet Mercury instead of Earth. Everything about us, including our history, is largely the same. We're just 2 planets closer to the Sun. Outside of philosophy, this world just isn't feasible within the many worlds interpretation, or a quilted multiverse. Mercury is just way too hot and way too inhospitable. Perhaps we might be able to go there one day, very, very far into the future with the right technology. But the truth is, within this universe, there's no real imaginable way that humanity would be able to start out there with no technology and amount to much of anything at all. So scientifically, this isn't really a possible world. But philosophically, this setup is technically feasible. Now, despite that difference, Lewis's commitments to possible worlds may seem a little bit less absurd now, if I've done my job properly. Perhaps what he's put forward is possible. But as weird as all of this may seem, the truth is we've only just started to go down the rabbit hole. Things only get stranger as we move from the possible to the impossible. Now, before we take this to the next level and start talking about impossible worlds, we probably should take a quick second and get a grip on what we mean when we say possibility and impossibility. Typically, when we use the word impossible, we use it relatively casually. We might say something like, "It's impossible to get this work done before the end of the day," or "You're being impossible right now." The truth is, in those instances, and probably most all others, we're by definition using that word entirely incorrectly. There are very few, if any, instances where it's absolutely impossible to get some work done by the end of the day. Perhaps you focus more, have a couple more coffees, skip a lunch break, or just bring in as many people as you need to get it done. Even if all that still doesn't give you the momentum you need, and it turns out that you really can't do it, it's still not completely impossible for it to be done. Maybe it's impossible for you in that specific moment with the tools that you have at that specific time. But there's certainly some scenario we could imagine, some invention or methodology or algorithm that would allow the work to be done in the allotted time. That capability might not exist in that moment, but it's not impossible. When we want to use the term more correctly, we might start thinking of things that are physically impossible, like human beings being able to jump 5,000 feet in the air, or being able to travel back in time, or travel across the galaxy in a split second. These things are certainly impossible, right? In his book, Physics of the Impossible, astrophysicist Michio Kaku tackles the feasibility of the most awe-inspiring tropes and ideas from science fiction. So he talks about not only things like the aforementioned time travel or intergalactic travel, but also superweapons like the Death Star, or teleportation or invisibility. In the book, Kaku tells us that if the right technology were to be developed, a lot of these unthinkable capabilities aren't impossible at all. With enough control over energy, we could use things like wormholes to travel across the universe, or even travel back in time. In fact, there's very little that he's able to rule out as outright impossible. And in Michio Kaku's exercise, he's only referring to possibility under the laws of physics as we know them. In philosophy, there's no reason that we can't imagine a possible world that exists under a different set of physical laws, where gravity is half as strong, or where entropy doesn't exist, or where every action no longer has an equal and opposite reaction. And even though the most hardline physicists might scoff at the suggestion of the feasibility of these types of worlds, it's still technically one possible arrangement that we can imagine, no matter how distant the chance of its existing. So then, at this point, in the philosophical sense, what exactly would be impossible? If even the laws of physics can be bent, what's left? Well, conveniently, we can think of impossibilities in 3 categories. The first is things that are mathematically impossible. 2 plus 2, as we all know, equals 4. It will never equal 5, 6, 7, or anything other than 4. Just like 3 times 3 will only ever be 9, or like the perimeter of a square will always be equal to the total length of its 4 sides, math is fixed. It's unbendable. For it to be other than it is, well, inconceivable. Second is logical impossibility. This category is possibly the trickiest because, as we've seen in past episodes of Grand Theories, there are some pretty sharp disagreements in how the laws of logic actually work. For example, classical logic, dating back to the days of Aristotle, dictates that if something is true, it can't also be false. However, there is a rising subset of logicians who deny this, who say there are times when something can be both true and false. Nonetheless, there are still certain things that just about every philosopher can agree is impossible in this category. For example, it isn't possible for every single thing in the world to be true. Just as it is true that 2 plus 2 is 4, it is false that 2 plus 2 equals 5. It can't be that 2 plus 2 is both 4 and 5. What is true has to be balanced out by what is false. Finally, and perhaps most interestingly, there are things which can be metaphysically impossible. This is for something to be completely at odds with the very core of what it's supposed to be. For example, let's think back to my blue t-shirt from earlier in the podcast. As something that is blue, the t-shirt is by nature also something that has a color. We could then say it would be impossible for something to be both blue and colorless. Just like it's impossible to have a square-shaped circle, or a cold heat wave, or a flat staircase. In these types of examples, the very function of what makes, for example, a staircase what it is completely nullified by its flatness. At its core, a staircase is meant to enable people and other beings to easily move from one elevation to another. There's no rule to how steep or how long or even how straight a staircase has to be. But for a staircase to be flat means that it no longer possesses the function that allows it to be a staircase in the first place. Perhaps to sum up this third category, it might be appropriate to cite a famous Mitch Hedberg joke. Quote, "An escalator can never break. It can only become stairs." End quote. Even though we can neatly categorize them, impossibilities are inherently difficult to really think about and imagine. Whether or not we are really capable of bringing them into our minds is, in fact, a rich topic of debate that goes back several hundred years within philosophy. David Hume famously drew the line between possibility and impossibility with our imaginations, meaning that if we can imagine something in our minds, it's possible, and thus the impossible consists of what we can't imagine. Many philosophers take great issue with the idea. First of all, it doesn't seem that we can even use our minds to imagine every possible thing, let alone impossible. Previous Grand Theory's protagonist, Graham Priest, is one of several philosophers to use a shape called a chiliagon to exemplify this. So as a hexagon has 6 sides and an octagon 8, a chiliagon has 1,000. It's a complex shape, and if you pull it up on Google, you won't really find a great representation of one. The sides are so small that your brain just sort of washes them out when you look at them from a meaningful distance. At the end of the day, it just pretty much looks like a circle. So as Priest puts it, even though he and all of us can technically understand what a chiliagon is, we can't really form a picture of it in our minds. But as far as our imagination goes, being able to form a picture of something in our mind is just the start of how it works. We can also just simply use language to come up with things. With language, we can skip imagery and simply describe impossible things. Take the colorless blue t-shirt, for example. Conjuring up an image of that is really beyond my or anyone else's capabilities. But I can certainly use words to come up with that and even try to explain the concept. In fact, I just did that. And some philosophers argue that with this capability comes a limitless capacity to come up with impossible things. And it's this ability, this power, if you will, that brings us to impossible worlds. As we stated earlier, possible worlds can be simply understood as ways things could have been. Impossible worlds, then, as put by philosophers Franz Berto and Mark Yago, are the way things could not have been. And for a world to be impossible, it must contain at least one instance of the mathematical, logical, or metaphysical impossibilities that we just discussed. So think back to the red mist world I talked about earlier, the one where sound travels faster than light and there was nothing but the square sand planet. As wacky or as unlikely as that world sounds, it technically isn't impossible in the sense we've defined it. But if you were to somehow add just one impossible object, let's say a flat staircase, the red mist universe instantly becomes an impossible world. So to put it casually, impossible worlds can have degrees of impossibility. A world where everything is normal except for my colorless blue t-shirt is technically an impossible world. Even though that t-shirt would be a puzzling anomaly, it doesn't seem that that world would be all that interesting compared to ours. But on the other end, we can imagine impossible worlds filled to the brim with all sorts of puzzling objects, situations, and rules. A world where the principles of mathematics are completely different than ours, or perhaps they're constantly ever-changing. There could technically be an impossible world where there's no logic or order at all. Trying to picture these higher intensity impossible worlds is, as we've detailed, a challenge for our minds. But we can certainly describe them in an abstract sense. These chaotic worlds would be unpredictable and unsuitable for any sort of ordered, calm life. In fact, it seems unlikely that any sort of intelligent beings would be able to emerge in these worlds at all. Visually, their contents might remind us of a glitched-out game or computer program. Mathematical word problems would become absolute nightmares. If Jimmy goes to the store and buys 4 apples, and then he buys another 6 oranges, he may end up with 2 bananas. Things like grocery shopping, paying bills, or just functioning in this type of existence would be impossible. At this level of abstraction, why do we think about impossible worlds? Don't we have our hands full enough with just possible worlds alone? Well, on the technical side of things, impossible worlds have a lot of utility for philosophers, just like possible worlds do. They help with logical proofs and metaphysical exercises. They allow philosophers to formally define what's actually possible in the world around us. On the other end, if you really want to put a bad metaphysical idea to rest, you can use logic to try to banish it to the realm of impossible worlds. But wouldn't the usefulness of these worlds stop with this type of abstract reasoning? If impossible worlds are the way things couldn't have been or can never be, they can't possibly be real. So if you're not a high-level philosopher, what's the point of talking about them? Even David Lewis himself didn't accept impossible worlds as real, although he did facetiously say that if he wasn't such a commonsensical person, that he probably would have. Well, for starters, a Japanese philosopher named Takashi Yogisawa makes the point that if you're going to accept that possible worlds are actual, real worlds, you may as well go ahead and accept impossible worlds as well. And if you think this is wild, well, it is. But Yogisawa has a very important reason as to why this is the case. And to understand that, we need to talk about the 5th dimension. When we think about any object, the default view would be to imagine it at its essence in the standard 3 dimensions of height, length, and width. So take a box, for example. A regular old box might be something like 12 inches tall, 12 inches wide, and say 10 inches long. When we think of what makes that box what it is, we're probably thinking of it as consisting of all the cardboard parts that exist within those dimensions. We can think of just about any physical objects and its parts in this way. So when you imagine what a specific person is, you imagine all the parts of them that exist within their 3-dimensional boundaries. Heads, arms, feet, internal organs, bones, all that stuff. In this sense, what we are is rooted in the space that we occupy. In philosophy, this view is known as 3-dimensionalism. And I would argue that this is typically how most of us look at things in the world in our day-to-day lives. But there is a competing view known as 4-dimensionalism, which adds one more level of existence to objects, and that level is time. So for a 4-dimensionalist, you can't look at things like boxes, people, or escalators and see the whole story of what that thing is in just one moment. You have to consider their other temporal parts. To see what I mean, let's talk about a philosophical thought problem called the Ship of Theseus. Theseus is a legendary hero figure from the halls of Greek mythology. Throughout his life, Theseus was a great warrior who tallied a huge number of conquests under his belt, the mythical Minotaur perhaps being the most famous. On top of this, according to tradition, Theseus is credited to have founded the great city of Athens. Therefore, after he moved on from this life, the people of Athens felt that an appropriate way to memorialize Theseus was to permanently moor his ship in the Athenian harbor. It remained there for hundreds of years, and as any sailor knows, leaving a boat anchored for any length of time is a costly endeavor. The elements tend to be very unfriendly to boats' exterior elements even over short amounts of time, let alone hundreds of years. In order to realize a proper honoring of Theseus, the Athenians obsessively kept up on the maintenance. Over time, this led to replacing a large number of wooden planks, oars, sails, and other parts as they wore out. Over those hundreds of years, we can't really account for how much of the ship was replaced. But for this thought experiment, let's assume that every single part, at some point, was replaced at least once. So at a certain point, none of the original ship of Theseus remained. That means that eventually, the entire ship was made of parts that Theseus himself never touched. This warrants the question then, is it still the Ship of Theseus? This is a question that is certainly interesting to think about. There have been a number of responses from a wide variety of philosophical perspectives. But it's into the lap of 4-dimensionalists that working through this problem seems to fall into. A 4-dimensionalist would argue that, of course, it's still his ship. Instead of viewing it as just an object that exists in space, a 4-dimensionalist views the ship as an object that stretches across time. So in essence, the ship at the moment right after it was built is just one part of what the entire Ship of Theseus is. His ship hundreds of years later, even though it has different material, is just one other equal part of the entire ship. So just like one wooden plank would be one part of the ship to a 3-dimensionalist, a snapshot of the entire ship in any particular moment in time is just one unit of the ship to a 4-dimensionalist. The 4D argument makes a lot of sense in this thought problem, and realistically it makes a lot of sense in the context of our lives. Not always do we look at one specific slice of time when we're considering or analyzing something. Take finding a job, for example. When you interview with a prospective employer, they aren't only analyzing the present part of you that's sitting right there in front of them. Sure, they'll take note of what you're wearing, how you present yourself, and your current skills and abilities. But when ultimately deciding whether or not to hire you, they're going to be thinking of both past and future parts of you as well. They'll look at if your past parts got into any legal trouble, or what your former colleagues might say about those past parts. They'll also look at how your future parts will actually perform on the job, how those future parts will get along with colleagues. This is particularly true in sports. Many sports franchises will try to entice young stars to super long-term contracts, largely because of how a future part of them is likely to perform, all of which is based on the performance of their past parts. In all of these cases, it almost seems that the employers are perhaps the least worried about who someone is in the present. So while nothing is ever one-sided, taking on a four-dimensionalist philosophy could dictate that we withhold from judgment based on something that happened in the past. It might implore us to wait until time has played all its cards before counting our fortunes and misfortunes. So, three-dimensionalists view objects as being composed of parts in space. Four-dimensionalists see things as having parts in space and time. A five-dimensionalist believes that objects extend into and beyond space and time, and into all other possible worlds. Compared to the 3D and 4D views, the five-dimensionalist is much more hard to find in the world of philosophy. The first explicit mention I could find of the term was in a 2006 Italian ontology volume, where the author explained what five-dimensionalism would technically be, but wrote it off as somewhat absurd. And no doubt it's a challenging thing to be a five-dimensionalist, but there actually are some out there. Andrew Graham is an American philosopher who, in a 2015 paper, advocated for why it makes sense to be a five-dimensionalist. One strong point that he makes is that we can't always distinguish between two things using space and time alone. There are many things that share the same space and time throughout their existence. Consider the intersection of two roads. We'll call them 4th Street and 5th Avenue. That intersection is technically two objects. It is a section of 4th Street, and it is also a section of 5th Avenue. So these two objects in this sense share the exact same space. Now let's imagine that both 4th Street and 5th Avenue are being constructed at the exact same time. Imagine that the crews work tirelessly on building the entirety of both roads, and end their work by completing the intersection last. As that intersection comes into existence, the two roads share the exact same section of space, beginning at the exact same time. And let's say exactly 150 years later, the city's been long abandoned and the intersection finally returns back to the earth from years of elemental wear. At that point, those two objects existed for the exact same amount of time of 150 years. At this point, how do we really differentiate between the two? We can't use space because they both had the same space. Time won't work because they were in that space for the exact same amount of time, down to the microsecond. According to Graham, the best way to differentiate is to appeal to other possible worlds. Worlds where one of those roads occupied that intersection first, or where perhaps one of those roads didn't exist entirely. Graham argues that these five-dimensionalist methods help solve lots of other philosophical puzzles. He uses examples that sound straight out of the halls of science fiction, situations such as two people accidentally becoming fused into one being in a faulty teleporter. You might argue that these scenarios are so specific and specialized that we may never really need five-dimensionalism to explain very much. But as Graham puts it, if you already think of objects in 4 dimensions, and you accept possible worlds in the way folks like David Lewis do, you really don't lose anything by adding a 5th dimension into your arsenal. So despite the fact that we may not have to call on five-dimensionalism all that often, It doesn't change the fact that space and time alone can't explain the identity of every single thing. We need possibility as that fifth dimension to help explain the entirety of things. So as humanity continues to urbanize and we start sharing more and more space, we might have to call on five-dimensionalism ever increasingly as time passes. So this brings us back to our friend from just earlier in the podcast, Takashi Yogi Sawa. Yogi Sawa doesn't believe that possible worlds are real worlds that are out there somewhere like David Lewis does. As he puts it, Lewis sees possible worlds as something like the multiverse, with each one composing one universe. Yogi Sawa instead sees possible worlds as alternate snapshots of the same universe. Nonetheless, this doesn't stop him from using these worlds to think five-dimensionally. And if you remember from earlier, Yogi Sawa believes that if you're going to build a model using possible worlds, you should also include impossible worlds within that model. And he does just that by putting forward a five-dimensional model where people, beings, and other objects extend through space, time, possibility, and impossibility. So in a 3D universe, when you think of who you are, you'll probably think of who you are right now in this space and time. In a 4D world, who you are in this moment is just a very small part of you. The whole you is a combination of all the slices of you from the whole timeline of your life. In a 5D Yogi-Sawan universe, who you are now is a small, practically undetectable sliver of the entire you. In fact, even your entire life in this world is just as tiny in the grand scheme of your being. You and your parts extend endlessly throughout an infinite number of possible and impossible worlds. There is any version of you that you can imagine out there. There are many versions of you much like yourself in this world, but many that are not. There are versions that live in different eras and lead unrecognizably different lives. And there are versions of you out there in impossible worlds, perhaps interacting with impossible objects, or dealing the best you can in lands without logic or math to support them. There are even impossible versions of you, versions that completely contradict what you really are. And none of these counterparts is more important than any other. All of them combine equally to construct the infinite, endless you. And it's the endless possibility of all that we are that dictates a five-dimensionalist to withhold judgment on anyone or anything, ever. And in a 5D universe, everyone and everything was, is, and will be everything there ever is to do and be. Perhaps this is starting to sound like some sort of Instagram motivational clip. It might seem I'm about to tell you that you can do and be anything, even the impossible. But I promise I'm not going to sell you some product or ask you to sign up for a masterclass. Instead, we're going to end by coming back to Brian Greene. Remember him? The physicist who put forward the 9 different types of multiverse? We discussed 2 of those already, the quilted and quantum multiverses. The others are quite interesting as well, but we're going to go ahead and skip to his last type, the ultimate multiverse. The ultimate multiverse is something not only written about by Brian Greene, but by another physicist named Max Tegmark, who terms it as a level 4 multiverse. And it's arguably Tegmark who has advocated for the model most heavily in his work. Now, this is an extremely complicated idea, but I'll try my best to paraphrase. The ultimate multiverse is essentially a multiverse of multiverses that is built entirely by mathematics. Let me unpack that a little bit. Physicists and other quote-unquote hard scientists use mathematics as their primary tool to describe the physical fabric of the universe. But even though math is so important to understanding our world, we can't really see or sense that math around us. Or can we? In Tegmark's theory, math just doesn't describe the world around us, it is the world around us. Just like the quote-unquote material that makes up the characters in a video game is just really code, the material that makes you, me, and all of our surroundings up is a series of mathematical formulas. So if you dig down past the atoms, nuclei, quarks, strings, or whatever it is that's most fundamental, when you get to the end, you'll find nothing but numbers. And what Tegmark's Level 4 multiverse is made of is any and every possible world that can be described using mathematics. And to top it off, this ultimate or Type 4 multiverse is infinite in size. So as it goes, not only does it contain an infinite number of mathematically possible worlds, but they each occur an infinite number of times. It's this model that perhaps aligns the best with today's talk about possible worlds. But what about impossible worlds? Can we count these in the ultimate multiverse? Scientifically, it seems not. Greene and Tegmark both seem to rule them out of their models, and research suggests that the majority of scientists are on their side. I was able to find one paper by a mathematician named George Ellis, where he mused about the composition of a multiverse and how much variation it might allow for. In the most extreme version of a multiverse possible, he says there would be universes that are mathematically or logically lawless. But Ellis doesn't explicitly advocate for this setup, and it doesn't seem that, at this point in time, any scientist is really willing to. Philosophically, however, we've seen that there are those who, at least in some form, argue that impossible worlds are out there. And in the grand scheme of things, the idea of impossible worlds is a young one. More and more philosophers are beginning to talk about them and use them in their work. And at one time, it would have been difficult to imagine that anyone would take possible worlds to be real, in either science or philosophy. But look at us now. So we can imagine that 10, 20 years from now, the view on the reality of impossible worlds could be completely different. Our view at this snapshot in time may become archaic. So while science seems to have shut the door on these worlds, things seem to only be getting started in philosophy. Perhaps one day the two disciplines will meet in the middle once again. I'd like to close this episode by briefly touching on the thinking of Viola Cordova. Viola Cordova was an Apache philosopher who holds the distinction of becoming the first Native American woman to earn a doctorate in philosophy. Cordova's perhaps most famous work is a posthumously published collection of writings where she attempted to define an overall Native American philosophy, similar to how we use the terms Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy, among others. One of the key points that she makes is that, in a Native American philosophy, there is a tendency to see the universe and its events in terms of probabilities and not absolutes. This contrasts with fields like physics, where one of the ultimate aims could be said to define the universe completely so that we can predict anything and everything absolutely. In Cordova's philosophy, the universe is viewed as infinitely complex, underpinned by constant change and motion. The absolute truths about the universe, therefore, are simply this complexity and tendency toward change. Because of this, we'll never really be able to define it the way that physicists might aim to. And when making predictions, we have to instead use statements like, "it is likely that," or "it might." Now incidentally, this view does line up with some more recent discoveries in science. But appropriate to our discussion, it also lines up with today's topic. If we settle for our universe as just this one universe, it's complex enough, but perhaps science might one day conquer its inner workings. But in a multiverse of possible and perhaps impossible worlds that we may never be able to access and even still never understand, the ultimate truth is much broader than what we can see in our tiny little corner. When zooming out and looking at the whole thing, Cordova would be right. The depth of possibility would be infinite, and our best hope would be to understand at least a little of that using probability, possibility, and impossibility. Thank you so much for listening to episode 5. I hope you enjoyed this one. Next month we're talking about the philosophy of time. Follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook to stay updated on what I'm reading about. And thank you again for being a fan of the show. You don't know how much I appreciate it. Please contact me and get in touch, and we will see you next month.